The Last of Us is a series that I'm intimately familiar with, having played the first game multiple times and I've just rewatched the TV show too. I love this universe and these characters. Okay, I'm not a huge fan of Part 2, but I already did a video on that. I didn't play this particular remake at launch even though I really wanted to. The reason is pretty simple. I think $110 Australian is a fucking absurd price to pay for something I've already played through multiple times. The first game is one of my favourites though, and I wasn't going to pass up the opportunity to play a better looking version of it. So this re-review will not only cover the usual talking points, like how the game has changed since 2022, the different versions of it, and ultimately if it's a better game now, I'm also going to try and explain if this is worth your time if you've already played it. Maybe you're like me and you've played through the earlier versions and are unsure if there's any point to this remake, or maybe you've only played the PS3 original and nothing since. Or maybe this is your first rodeo and you might be wondering which version of the game you should start with. These and many more questions will be answered. What I'm not going to discuss is if it was necessary or why I think it was made. I think this is a somewhat moot point. I'm also not going to spend a ton of time comparing the presentation to the earlier versions. Digital Foundry has an hour-long video that does an excellent job of that, so I'd just be covering the same ground. And for those currently writing angry comments about me taking too long to get to the part where I tell you if it's good or not, it's called context. I quite like context. I think it helps frame ideas and opinions. So yeah, prepare for more of it. Oh, and for anyone new to these re-reviews wondering what's the deal, I create these videos because games rarely ship in complete or polished states anymore. Reviews that drop at launch are often based on a version of the game that is missing features, modes, and/or has major technical issues. Games almost always receive updates post-launch, and over time these can change them, radically in some cases, to become better experiences. So these re-reviews look at a game in its current state, well after its launch, to see what it's like now. I think reviewing a game outside the hype window also allows me to be slightly more objective. At least, I hope so. Finally, I'm going to do my best not to spoil the main plot points, but I've used a few examples that do include minor spoilers. I'll give you a heads up beforehand though. This remake originally dropped in 2022. That's 8 years after the 2014 remaster and almost a decade after the PS3 original. That's not a long time in the grand scheme of things. Typically it's older games that get the remake and remaster treatment. This was long enough to span 3 console generations, however, and each new platform has provided more fidelity, better controls, and better performance. Part 1 is no different. This remake actually differs quite a bit to the original and the remaster. The campaign is almost identical in terms of chapters and scenes, and it includes the Left Behind DLC. Beyond that though, there are numerous changes, both big and small. The omission of the multiplayer component called Factions is probably one of the biggest. This is because Naughty Dog had originally planned to ship the multiplayer as a standalone live service title called The Last of Us Online. This is one of the many live service projects planned by Sony that has since been cancelled. Part 1 makes plenty of changes elsewhere. The presentation is the most obvious, of course, but additionally it introduces new modes and it makes some significant changes to the gameplay. Each chapter plays out more or less the same as the older versions, albeit with new mechanics, better accessibility support, and new presentation options. It hasn't received any DLC beyond the Left Behind prologue, although it has received numerous updates. So let's take a look at some of the notable changes and how they've improved and altered the experience. Firstly, let's address the PC port. It's no secret that the game on PC at launch was a big old pile of poopy. Frequent crashes, poor performance, shader compilation shenanigans, and some caterpillar eyebrows from hell were reported by tons of players and media outlets alike. There have been a number of patches that address these issues directly, and based on the patch notes and reports by players, many of the issues at launch seem to have been resolved or dramatically improved. Load times and frame pacing were two of the most problematic issues, and this appears to have been a focus of the PC updates. RAM usage has been reined in, stuttering is less egregious, and again, the sentiment online seems to be that PC is in a much better place now. I'm not going to say it's fixed, because you don't have to search hard to find people still complaining about it, but it's certainly not the dumpster fire it was at launch. Okay, how about the PS quintuple? So it also received many technical improvements, but I think the most interesting change is the 120Hz fidelity mode. This is now capped at 30 frames per second, where previously it allowed for 40, so long as you had a high refresh rate TV or monitor. The PS5 Pro unsurprisingly got a patch too that added a new Pro mode. This renders the game at 1440p and then uses PSSR to upscale the image to 4K while targeting 60 frames per second. Now, while things are much better across all platforms, that's not to say you can't still find jank. I played through on the PS5 using a mixture of the performance and fidelity modes, and to be clear, this is not a janky game. Naughty Dog games are just usually polished to a high sheen, which is why the examples I've shown here stand out so much. Given how incredible the rest of the game looks, they can be a little distracting and pull you out of the moment. I think what's interesting about the updates is that, although there have been plenty of bugs and performance fixes, especially for PC, Naughty Dog has continually tweaked and refined things like accessibility and gameplay. There's too many changes to list them all, but some curious examples are things like companions are more helpful now, throwing bricks at enemies and even saving you from time to time. Lots of attacks, such as the melee attacks that send enemies to their knees, now combo into finishes. Weapon behaviour has been modified in some interesting ways too, such as rifles now using hit scans instead of projectiles. There are loads of other little tweaks like these that modify the way the game plays, and while I think most of them make sense, I wonder if there's more to these updates than meets the eye. For sure, this remake, at least partially, was designed to capitalise on the success of the show, kind of like how this video is. But given it was praised so highly at launch, surely there's no reason to refine what most people already thought was good. I suspect Naughty Dog are iterating on it for another reason. Maybe for a future Last of Us title, or possibly for Intergalactic. Either way, the number of small improvements over the past 2 years have changed the game, and in most cases have made it more enjoyable. Okay, let's talk about the presentation. So I'm a strong proponent of gameplay being more important than graphics. Having said that, I don't think this rule applies to every game. For some games, the presentation is an integral part of the experience. Games like Firewatch, Narita Boy and Cuphead rely on their visuals for storytelling, and wouldn't hit as hard if their visual design was more generic. The same goes for sound design. Hellblade or Control just wouldn't be the same if their audio design sucked. I think a game like The Last of Us benefits substantially from better visuals. This is a game which relies heavily on things like environmental storytelling and character performances to tell the story. So more detail and more nuanced facial expressions can make a massive difference. Both the 2013 and 2014 games excelled at storytelling, although this remake is on a completely different level, to the point where it can make spaces and scenes that you've seen many times before seem new. I'm going to talk about a spoiler now, so skip to the time on the screen or use the chapters to avoid it. Take the scene with Joel and Rebecca at the start. This was every bit as devastating on this most recent playthrough as it was on my first, even though I knew it was coming. The character models and the expressions on their faces in particular so much more closely matches the performances that are being given, and it just hits so much harder. Animations across the board are just better. Characters move more gracefully, and the new AI makes for more believable NPCs. Beyond that, the increased detail, more impressive lighting, and the myriad of other visual changes communicate the haunting beauty of this dystopia in a way that the earlier versions weren't able to. One of the things I love about these games is exploring each environment and getting a sense of what happened there long ago. It's this level of environmental storytelling that makes it so easy to get lost in this universe. Sometimes spaces can have multiple layers of narrative, such as how the space was originally used, what might have happened recently, and what's happening now. The remake builds on the strength of the earlier versions, and the level of detail here is pretty insane. Part 1 is definitely more violent and gory too. In the original, it's easier to justify your actions against enemies like the Infected through cognitive dissonance because they're easy to dehumanize. I think this is largely because they don't look real. The remake's visuals aren't photorealistic, of course, but they have reached a level of fidelity that's more convincing, and I found this made it harder to see enemies simply as threats to be dispatched. I get that not everyone will be able to or want to detach from the moral disengagement as I did, but I really appreciate the added layer of depth for those who want to nerd out in the game's themes. As good as they are, I don't think the visuals are a clear upgrade across the board. In a couple of instances, I prefer the art direction of the remaster. Some of the lighting is more dramatic, for example. Although, by and large, I think the remake is vastly superior, and any perceived downgrades are overwhelmed by the quality and quantity of improvements elsewhere. I'm going to stop crapping on now. The point I want to make is that the graphics aren't just better, they're transformative and take an already incredible experience to the next level. I didn't love Part 2. No, that's not true. I hated Part 2, but that's not because of how it played. In fact, that's one of the things I found the most frustrating about it. From a gameplay point of view, I think it's really satisfying. Everything feels cohesive and seamless, from the larger, more open level design, to the combat, to the crafting, and how it transitions from cutscenes to gameplay. Part 1 takes much of what I love about playing Part 2, sans the story, and retrofits it into the original game. I guess from a purist standpoint, these could be seen as unnecessary deviations from the original. I see them as logical iterative improvements that allow it to play as good as the story it's telling. Take weapon customization in the workbench. Joel doesn't just perform some kind of hidden magic anymore. You actually see him make the specific modifications in real time, and the weapon's appearance changes accordingly. This is a much better diegetic approach, and it further sells Joel's ability as a complete survivalist. What you can change has been increased too. The shotgun, for example, now has upgrades that impact spread and recoil, so it feels like you have a bit more agency, and choosing upgrades isn't as straightforward as it used to be. I think the new AI is worth mentioning too. It's a bit of a mixed bag, honestly. On one hand, it's disappointing that enemies are still blind to your companions, even in the grounded mode. It really undermines how immersive the rest of the experience is. Although, I'm guessing this was a deliberate design choice, as the game would be too punishing otherwise. On the other hand, it can serve up some really incredible and unexpected moments. Like this one. I'd alerted the bad guys, and this one enemy hid inside this hallway and waited for me to deal with his mate. He then rushed me down, catching me completely off guard. Or this moment in the same gunfight where one enemy had me pinned down with suppressing fire so that another one could close in. This is just one encounter, and the game is full of these amazing unscripted moments. Despite the numerous changes, however, the gameplay hasn't lost the feeling of the original. There's still that constant tension of trying to figure out how to deal with the threat in front of you with the resources you currently have. Making it through each encounter is like a small victory, only to come across something even more challenging shortly afterwards. There are currently 3 official options for playing the remake: PC, PS5 and the PS5 Pro. All 3 are identical from a gameplay and content point of view, with the main differences being the presentation and performance options. The base PS5 offers performance and fidelity modes. Performance gives you a pretty solid 60 frames per second at 1440p. Yeah, the 4K as it turns out is complete BS. Whereas fidelity gives you a native 4K at 30 frames per second. I played through it predominantly in performance mode because I don't think the higher resolution is worth cutting the frame rate in half. Technically, there's a couple of other modes if you have a high refresh rate monitor or TV and you want to mess around with VRR and the 120Hz options. If that's you, I've dropped a link in the description to a Digital Foundry video that explains these modes in detail. On the PS5 Pro, you get the best of both worlds without any trade-offs. The Pro also has improved textures, shadows, and better effects too. You do have to squint pretty fucking hard to see these differences if you ask me though. PC offers the highest graphical fidelity, supporting a native 4K at 60 frames per second or higher. It also supports Nvidia's DLSS and AMD's FSR. All of this is dependent on your hardware, of course. So choosing the right option really comes down to preference. For the best visual fidelity and performance, the PC version can be the best, provided you have a high-end system. It's probably still the most buggy, although by the sounds of it, it's much improved over the day one version. If console is your preference, the original PS5 provides a solid experience in both the fidelity and performance modes, and if you have a PS5 Pro, you get slightly enhanced graphics and performance. In general, you really can't go wrong with any version. They all play well now, and excluding graphics settings, the core experience is exactly the same.
There seems to be some commotion coming from
What was that? Oh God. Dad?
I think the biggest and most obvious question here is, have the new visuals and gameplay improvements made it worthwhile, especially for people who've already played the other versions? If you're the type of person who routinely plays their favourite games over and over again, then the answer is an easy yes. This is by far the best way to play the first game, and while there are some minor differences, both in how the story is told and how it plays, it's not like what George Lucas did to the original Star Wars trilogy. When talking about fidelity and playability, Part 1 is objectively better than the PS3 and PS4 games. You could argue that those versions hit harder for certain artistic reasons, and maybe you're right, but from a technical standpoint, Part 1 is unquestionably better. If, however, you've only played the original or remaster back when they came out, and that experience occupies a part of your brain that you hold dear, you might be concerned that playing this will somehow ruin that memory. Like that time I rewatched The Dark Crystal, and it ended up killing a part of my childhood. Part 1 isn't likely to do this. From a visual point of view, it is significantly different, but otherwise it's almost identical to the original from a storytelling point of view. It's not a shot-for-shot remake, but it's pretty damn close. If you've never played it before, then for sure, Part 1 would be the best option. There have been a number of updates since launch that improve things like performance, bugs, and accessibility, so it delivers a more polished experience than what was seen at launch. This is especially true for the PC version. I think the older versions still hold up. Even on the PS3, it remains a great title, pushing that hardware to its limits. Given the option though, this is the definitive version of the game. So far.